Trains have appeared in many films throughout the years, as everything from the setting of the story to being part of a greater action set piece. As cool as these scenes are, not all of these engines are true to real life, and that gets on my nerves. So today, we're going to take a look at everything wrong with the trains in Before we know the trains, let's first know the context. The story features Armie Hammer, a good-natured, by-the-book lawyer returning to his hometown in Texas to visit his brother. Also arriving in town is crazy Native American Tonto, as played by Johnny Depp wearing controversial amounts of makeup, and notorious cannibal outlaw Butch Cavendish, as played by William Fichtner. Cavendish escapes capture, derails a train, and goes on the run. And so MC Hammer joins his brother and a team of Texas Rangers to recapture the menace. And no, the irony of Armie Hammer facing off against a cannibal is not lost on me. After an ambush by the bandits and watching Cavendish eat his brother's heart, Hammer is left for dead. Upon being rescued by Tonto, Hammer learns that Cavendish was freed on purpose, and swears to bring the outlaw to justice for not saving him any leftovers. This happens 50 minutes into the film, by the way, in case you were worried the pacing was going to be an issue. Anyway, after a series of going to places and talking to people, it's revealed that years ago, Cavendish and the guy in charge of the local railroad discovered silver in a nearby mountain. Having killed Tonto's tribe to keep the location of the silver safe, they've returned all these years later to dig it up and sell it in San Francisco. Because the silver is on native land, and because I guess a new tribe moved in, Cavendish frames them by raiding nearby settlements in Native American attire, so the railroad can justify killing the tribe, allowing them to build a line to the silver mine through native land. That's right, the railroads are the bad guys in this movie. Manifest destiny is one hell of a drug. After coming to this revelation, nearly 2 hours into the film, the plot culminates on a full-on, balls-to-the-wall train chase with Hans Zimmer's rendition of the William Tell Overture blasting in the background. The entire sequence is completely unearned and so tonally out of place with the rest of the movie, but damn, it goes hard. Trains fall, bad guys die, and the day is saved? ? I mean, the bad guys were defeated and Tonto got his revenge, but an entire native tribe got wiped out and multiple innocents were murdered, so the end? Other notable things in this film include Helena Bonham Carter playing a prostitute with an ivory shotgun leg that men get weirdly touchy around. Armie Hammer has a romance arc with his dead brother's wife that's about as poorly written as it sounds. Every man who meets this poor woman, by the way, either harasses her or gets shot. And Tonto keeps saying spiritual stuff, talking about nature magic and calling the bad guys Wendigos, but we're flat out told none of it's true, so it just leaves him looking like a rambling idiot. There are so many weird moments and inconsistencies in the film. Why not share your favourite ones in the comments? Mine is in the opening, when this kid and old Tonto are shown putting peanuts in their mouth straight from the bag, which are then later shown to be unshelled, implying that both of them are just scarfing down these nuts with the shell still on. I could keep going, but we're not here for a film review. We're here to look at an impressive amount of rails and rolling stock were assembled for the shooting of this movie. 2 prop locomotives were built for use in various scenes in the final chase. The first one, a 460 nicknamed John's train, was used in the opening Derailment, with the boiler and cab swapped out for the rest of the movie where it appeared as Constitution. The other locomotive is a replica of 440 Jupiter, one of the 2 engines actually present at the Golden Spike ceremony that signified the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The freight cars and carriages too were built from scratch for the purposes of shooting, but most impressively, over 5 miles of physical Class 2 track was laid for everything to run on. A giant oval was built in New Mexico by Gandy Dancer Railroad and Excavating Services for shots of the trains in motion, with many other, smaller sections of track built in various sets and locations. In scenes that depicted tracks being laid, certified railroad workers were hired as background actors, with many other extras having been professionally educated on how to build and lay rails for extra realism. While not actual functioning steam locomotives, both Constitution and Jupiter were equipped with a pair of diesel engines in their tenders and computers mounted in their cabs, allowing them to move on their own. They were capable of reaching speeds of up to 30 miles an hour, with many scenes being shot actually going at that speed while the actors were physically scrambling all over them. When the locomotives weren't in shot, however, an EMD SW1500 diesel would be used instead to move the convoy. The engines could also be partially disassembled, the boilers and cabs able to be detached from the frames so they could be loaded onto flatbed lorries, allowing them to be driven along the road in locations where they couldn't physically build rails. For those wondering why the studio used props instead of real functioning preserved locomotives, put simply, it all comes down to the props being cheaper and easier to build, use and modify than the real thing, while also appearing functionally identical. Sure, it would have been nice to see the real Jupiter replica in this film, but when you're shooting at it, having actors climb all over it and generally at risk of damaging it, it makes more sense to just build a prop that you're free to do whatever you want with, especially when the general audience won't know the difference anyway. Credit where it's due, a lot of thought and effort went into making the props as realistic as possible, and the teams behind Constitution and Jupiter did a pretty good job making the engines look believable while also giving them a very sweaty and filthy style that adds character. I, however, am not here to congratulate them on their work, but rather be that jerk who picks apart everything wrong with said work for the entertainment of the masses. So let's take a look at some scenes, shall we? The first locomotive we see in the film is a 460 pulling a passenger service to the town of Colby, Texas. I couldn't find any clear shots of the engine in the film itself, but looking at the behind the scenes footage, it seems the engine isn't directly styled on one locomotive in particular, but is more of a hodgepodge of various 460 designs, with the main basis being Illinois Central 382. The engine driven by Casey Jones the night he ran his train into a big old caboose. 382, however, wasn't built until 1898, 29 years after the Lone Ranger takes place. Strangely, some parts of the engine are period accurate. After consulting my local American locomotive specialist, the domes on the engine are styled after the ones on the engines at Promontory Summit, so they at least get some credit for period accuracy in that regard, but the cab design is completely made up, so the credit gets revoked. This sweeping shot also gives us a good look at the cars and carriages too. At first I felt they were too square and boxy in design compared to most American passenger cars, but after doing a little digging into post-Civil War era rolling stock, it seems that design was common at the time. Part of me feels the proportions might be a little off on the balcony, but otherwise, a solid effort. It's in this same scene we're introduced to our soon-to-be protagonist, where he accidentally throws a child's toy out of the window. Now, I'm no physicist. If I was, I'd be out doing something meaningful with my life. But in order to produce a vacuum strong enough to pull that toy out of the window, either the train would have to be going way faster than it is, or it's apocalyptically windy outside. Later, a bunch of bandits show up, giving us a better look at the carriages, which seem to be a mix of all sorts of styles and designs with one or two luggage and way cars thrown in. For some reason, a few of them have their brake wheels mounted on the roof of the cars as opposed to the balcony area, which isn't unheard of for freight cars, but why they'd be on the roofs of passenger stock is beyond me. Also, the passenger cars having ladders on them is an interesting choice. I can't think of a situation in which a person would need access to the roof of a passenger car frequently enough to justify installing a ladder. nor can I think of a reason why you'd mount an axe on the outside of a way car next to the door. In the shots where the driver and fireman get murked, we get a better view of the engine's footplate, not only showing us the inside of the cab, but also the radical discrimination autistic people have suffered throughout the years while simply trying to enjoy a hobby. My initial worry looking at this is the firebox and its concerning lack of fire. The inside of a real locomotive firebox would be bright orange from the intense heat needed to power the engine, so unless that dinky flame is somehow putting out over 2000 degrees Kelvin, that's another ding. The controls are a little janky too. I cannot for the life of me figure out why this engine has two reversers. For all you non-railroad enthusiasts out there, the reverser is the lever you pull to determine whether the engine goes forwards or backwards, and what this guy is trying to achieve by chaining them together. Even giving him the benefit of the doubt and saying that one of these levers works the brakes, and doing this disables them and puts the engine into full forwards, he's not at all touched the throttle. The throttle being this lever that determines how fast you go. So the engine shouldn't really speed up too much. From the brief glance we do get of the throttle, it looks as if it's fully closed anyway, which makes sense given that the train would be slowing down as it approaches the town. And seeing how desperate Dan doesn't even touch it, the train has no reason to speed up. I feel the bigger concern in this situation anyway wouldn't be the engine's speed, but rather how shoddily maintained it is. The very next shot we see of the cab, the dials are going haywire, steam is spraying, and the metal looks heavily water damaged, implying a lot of these pipes are leaking. Given the pressure in the boiler would be well over 130 psi while operating, any leak at all could spell disaster, so the fact this thing hasn't exploded yet is nothing short of miraculous. To get the dials to jump up like that too also implies the water level in the boiler is dangerously low. Again, amazing this thing hasn't gone reactor 4 yet. At the side of the line, during a roof fight, there's this random hook on a post which they use to recreate that one moment in Pirates of the Caribbean with somehow even wonkier physics, and I cannot for the life of me figure out what it would be used for. The closest thing I can think of would be a mail hook for post trains, but even then it's too high up for that, miles away from the town, and that mail system wouldn't come into widespread use for another 2 decades. Eventually, an actual ranger shows up and helps uncouple the carriages from the locomotive. At the time the film is set, railroads were using a mix of all kinds of couplers, but the most commonly used one was link and pin. American knuckle couplers, as we know them today, wouldn't really appear until about 1879. However, the trains in this movie use these weird couplers that are a strange mix between Janny couplers and the ones you get on those Duplo toy trains. To gauge whether or not these couplers would be realistic or even feasible on a real railway, I asked my resident American railroad expert what he thought.
I think I'm gonna...
From this, we can draw our own conclusions. Finally, we come to the first derailment of the whole movie. There's a lot happening here, so I'm gonna have to break it down second by second. After initially coming off the rails, the cowcatcher at the front digs into the ground and starts flinging railroad ties everywhere. Most cowcatchers of the time would have been made of wood, and so it wouldn't have been flinging ties for long before the wood would have broken off. But some cowcatchers were made of metal, so who knows? Maybe down in Texas they just made theirs out of galvanized square steel. As it continues forward, the engine tips onto its side. Not unheard of in derailments, but the wheels are somehow still turning as it's tipped over. Locomotive wheel sets are rigid. Both wheels are fixed to the axle, so if one moves, both move, and if one cannot move, neither can the other. Because of this, the wheels that are burying themselves in the ground shouldn't be turning, so by extension, neither should these. The biggest offense in this scene, however, is this boxcar, which somehow goes absolutely flying over everything in front of it. Trains carry a lot of momentum, and cars can end up pushing each other off the rails or even upwards when an engine suddenly stops, but to launch a 20-ton boxcar through the air like a Scouse brick at Oswald Mosley would take forces beyond human comprehension. or a very big trebuchet. Also being launched is this connecting rod, which on a real locomotive shouldn't flex at all. The pistons on a steam engine aren't nearly powerful enough to push against the rod with that much force, and the connecting rod itself shouldn't flex or bend. They need to stay rigid so no energy is lost when turning the wheels. Otherwise it'd be like trying to row a boat with a giant spring. Somehow, even on its side, the locomotive still has enough momentum to keep sliding an absurd distance, but finally it does come to a stop, where we can see the last issue, it being this flame that's coming out the side of the boiler. For those who don't have intimate knowledge of steam locomotives, their boiler is essentially a giant tube filled with water, with several smaller copper tubes running through them. The copper tubes carry heat from the firebox which boils the water, generating steam to make the thing go. An awful lot of pressure builds up in these boilers, so punching a hole in the side would not only spray out a huge jet of steam instead of fire, but also probably cause the boiler to burst like the world's most violent gender reveal balloon. For fire to be coming out of the boiler like that means there is something seriously wrong with this engine's plumbing. And with that, we're finally done with this film's opening. Boy, it took us a long time to get here, and I'm afraid we still have a long way to go. Luckily, there isn't too much railroady stuff between here and the ending, so I'll just brush over the few errors that pop up. Firstly are these tracks which were apparently built in native territory and somehow buried in the sand. This is more of a plot issue than anything, but what I want to know is how the railroad company built the tracks in the first place without anyone knowing about it. Railway construction is hard to do discreetly. Speaking of discrete tracks, sometimes you can see the rest of the giant oval they built in the background if you look carefully in some scenes. Later, we get a shot of Constitution in all its glory and the construction of a nice trestle bridge. Nothing particularly wrong with this scene either, but I think it's awful brave of them to park the engine so close to a cliff. Not nearly as brave as these boys here who just take a face full of scalding steam straight from the engine cylinders. I'll save a bit of time and say that everything that was wrong with that 460 earlier also applies to Constitution. Also, Constitution doesn't have any sort of coupling at the front, which isn't a massive issue as the engine would be running pilot forwards most of the time anyway, but the inability to connect anything to the front of the locomotive would certainly make shunting a pain. All you die-hard modelers out there might get a kick out of this train set the railroad guy has aboard his personal carriage. Not only is it seemingly an electric train set in 1869, but also it's double O gauge too, a scale that wasn't invented until 1921. Also, I'm going to put a point on the wrong counter just for this kid's abysmal engine driving skills. Though if the driver of the actual engine is anything to go by, then I should really blame his mentors. In the shot here of the train disconnecting from some cars, these two hoses here swing down which seem to be connectors for air brakes. And a later shot of Constitution's cab confirms this is the case. Though air brakes were invented around this time, they wouldn't really come into use on many railroads for a few more years. Also, the engine has no throttle lever, is horribly maintained, and all the dials are at 0. My guess is all that leaking steam probably has something to do with it. Again, boiler explosion just waiting to happen. There's a few other period inaccuracies too that I want to go over. I know we're close to the end and you want to get to the big train chase, so I'll try and hurry this bit along. Throughout the movie, the railway company the bad guy works for is the
Transcontinental Railway Corporation,
which is entirely made up. The two main railroads behind completing the Transcontinental line were the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. At no point did the main route of the Transcontinental Railroad pass through Texas, so why the Transcontinental Company would be in Texas is a mystery. Plus, it was the Southern Pacific Railroad that were the ones building lines between San Francisco and New Orleans through Texas at the time. Adding to the confusion is later in the film, they've got this banner that says Promontory Summit on it. That's in Utah. Specifically, the location where the Golden Spike ceremony took place that marked the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Why they're celebrating it in Texas is beyond me. The fact that Jupiter is here, one of the two engines present at the real event, raises even more questions. Why is a Central Pacific locomotive in Texas? Why specifically the one from the actual Golden Spike ceremony? Why are they recreating the ceremony in a random town 1,000 miles away from the actual site? Do you see what historical inaccuracy leads to? Can you understand the headache this gives to people who care? Okay, one last one, they've got quite a few of the details on Jupiter wrong. Going off the replica, they have the wrong style spark arrestor on the smokestack, the steam dome is painted instead of brass, whistle is in the wrong place, boiler proportions are off, wheels aren't quite the right size, wrong/missing valve gear, the steps at the front that aren't on the original, and the cowcatcher is the wrong size. Also, blink and you'll miss it detail on the tender are the letters WPRR, which at a guess is meant to stand for Western Pacific Railroad. The real Jupiter belonged to the Central Pacific Railroad, so that W should be a C. Despite all that, it's somehow the only engine in this film to have any form of coupler or connection point at the front, so well done there. And finally, here we are, the infamous ending train chase. Boy, we've had to go through a lot of movie to get here, but at long last, the bit you've all been waiting for. Now, I could go over the entire scene frame by frame, but I've essentially been doing that all video, and I think it's getting a little tedious. Given this film was pretty mundane throughout, only to end with crazy action and loud music, I feel the only true way to wrap up this video would be to take a page out of the movie's book and do something similar. So what better way to do that than by nitpicking this sequence in song? That's wrong lever to start the train. The boiler pressure's not again. Why do none of the cars have their brakes applied? That's dangerous. Not your boilers are that bulletproof. Why are all those men upon that roof? They could hold their weight, but the horse's hoof would likely go through it. He grabbed the throttle wrong. You need to pull it back to go forwards. Which stands only indicate direction. Hitting them won't change the points. As a 440 catching up a 10-wheeler should be way ahead of them. Maybe they'd be faster if they fixed all the leaking joints. There's also this bit with the air brake, but we've already been over that. Why is there another track going up that ridge? They did an awful job when they built that bridge. How to fit a horse in that carriage? The door isn't wide enough. The car's going faster than the train. Look, there's those weird couplers again. Why's a brake wheel there? It'd be such a pain to reach when you want to stop. Why are passengers still aboard a train that was stopped in the town? You'd think they'd walk around and celebrate the railway opening. Somehow these hopper cars are moving faster than before. They really should have stopped climbing that steep grade. Speaking of grades, let's take a look at this track. For some reason the railway splits into two separate lines, but both travel along the same path. It wasn't unheard of for two lines to be built parallel during the construction of the Transcontinental, but to have both in a canyon like this is pretty damn mental. One track is like a roller coaster going up, down and around. That seems like a lot of wasted effort. Surely you'd choose the route much closer to the ground. The grades are just too steep for an engine to climb, it's stupid, it's janky, and one messed up railway line. Why are the cars so fast? You'd think that on such poor track they would have easily come off the rails by now. These hopper cars are whack, they have a weird shed truck design that makes no sense to me, and it just looks dumb. Nobody would build tracks like this, the line's too steep and bends too sharp. No way that car would keep that much momentum moving on its side. That crash would flip that van and throw off at least one hopper car. The metal frame wouldn't break when hit, so the van would slide. Or, you know, also derail the carriages that collide with it. Somehow the throttle applies the brake. That reverser is wrong, for God's sake. Every wrong detail, I swear, will take a year off my lifespan. Shooting a coupler won't break it. A car goes missing for a bit. This movie is the biggest pile of shit I've ever sends Jupiter out in a blaze of glory, even though it's a boring and dumb story. Finally, the train wreck happens. How has this part not collapsed? From the engine's weight, the wood it should have snapped. I guess they really did use galvanized square steel. In the end, in the movie The Lone Ranger, all the trains only ever seem to get stranger. How did Disney and Verbinski make a meal out of this show? Verbinski's the same guy who helped to make Rango. God, this movie annoys me, and I hope I never have to watch it ever again. In conclusion then, there's quite a few things wrong with the trains in this movie. From mild period inaccuracies to straight up defying the laws of physics. The whole movie is bad, but the thing is, I just can't bring myself to hate it. So much passion went into making this movie, and everyone involved gave it 110%. Like I said, they built real tracks, hired real railroad engineers, and they gave every engine, car, and location so much personality, despite not being entirely historically accurate. Even when production went over budget, Depp, Hammer, producer Jerry Bruckheimer, and director Gore Verbinski all agreed to drop 20% of their salaries just so the film could get made. The film had a troubled production, so it's hard to know who exactly is to blame for the inconsistent writing and awful pacing, but with all the references to so many classical westerns, it's clear this movie genuinely wanted to pay homage to the genre. In terms of train accuracy, I'd say the movie does alright. Real tracks and actual props are nice and all, but the finer details like controls, couplers, and overall period accuracy really bring the score down. Honestly, if they just gave all the engines a throttle lever and knuckle couplers, I don't think I would have minded so much. Heck, Jupiter had a throttle. I don't get why the other two engines didn't have one either. If you know nothing about trains, you probably won't care, but if you're pedantic like me, all the weird inconsistencies will really get on your nerves. For anyone who wants to actually go see the props in real life, they have been preserved. Constitution is on display at the Fillmore and Western Railway, and Jupiter resides at the Volo Auto Museum in Illinois. As for the rest of the movie, I'd give it a 3 out of 10. It's drawn out, cliché, and just a tonal mess. It's a shame, really. The original pitch for this movie was a western with a Pirates of the Caribbean-esque fantasy twist, which, to me, sounds awesome. Apparently the plot would have involved the Lone Ranger and Tonto facing off against werewolves and using cursed silver to make bullets to fight them. Hold on, what?